Ukraine has been given a green light from allies to blitz Russian targets with long-range Western weapons, stoking fears the conflict could still spiral into World War III. The Kremlin called the move a direct escalation. Kharkiv again, and this is the scene of yet another. We're in Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're going to start today with the developments, political developments announced or at least made clear today about the rules surrounding the use of Western weapons, not just on the battlefield per se, the battlefield in Ukraine, but at the battlefield further east, deep inside Russian soil, because we know that America has been urging Kyiv not to use its weapons on targets inside the Russian motherland. But today, Britain's Foreign Secretary, who's visiting Kyiv, has made it clear that Britain will allow its weapons to be used for those strikes. Lord Cameron was very clear. He said Ukraine absolutely has the right to carry out those missions. He said it must, in some cases, carry out those sorts of attacks. And this comes hot on the heels of comments from our Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, who said the American policy of urging Kyiv not to carry out those attacks was ridiculous. Now, this is really interesting because it's clearly showing a difference in the positions between Ukraine's allies, and it gives us a little glimpse into some of the difficulties that Ukraine has to navigate, the complex web of the different sets of rules of one ally giving weapons which they can use to do that, another ally providing ammunition which they can't use to do something else. Now, we know that weapons like Storm Shadows, the British supplied bunker busting cruise missiles, have been used to hit targets to devastating effect in Crimea. We suspect that allies have provided lots of support to Ukraine's successful naval maritime drone operations. Those are the sort of surface drones which have attacked and sunk Russian warships. It's unclear whether Western weapons have already been used in the successful campaign of revenge strikes, which Ukraine has been mounting for months against targets inside Russia. To recap what they've hit. They've hit airfields, they've hit train lines, they've hit oil refineries. Now, it's the oil refineries that have been perhaps the most high profile recently. It's the oil refineries that have sparked warnings from US officials to rein back. US officials fear two things. They fear the attacks on Russian soil are an escalation. That's what the Kremlin have called them. And what they are trying to avoid is that direct state-on-state confrontation between Russia and a NATO country, even though NATO is so fully invested in helping Ukraine to fight back Vladimir Putin's invasion. The other concern voiced by Americans is that these attacks on refineries are going to drive up prices. Indeed, they already have. An estimate by the Reuters news agency suggested that Russia's refining capability was knocked down by about 14%. They think Russia may have made repairs that's got it up to about 90% of where it was originally, but still that is hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil a day that it can't produce, and there's been a corresponding increase in oil prices, fuel prices inside Russia. So clearly that campaign by Ukraine is having an effect. The other comment on this worth noting, we heard from Latvia's foreign minister who confirmed that Western weapons were being delivered to Ukraine without the caveats, weapons that could be used theoretically for these strikes inside Russia. And we also heard at the back end of last week from Britain's Chief of Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, in an interview with the Financial Times. He predicted these long-range strikes on Russian soil would increase. So that's an area of the war that we're going to keep a close eye on. And it comes as the situation on the front lines remains really bleak inside Ukraine. Russia is advancing. I don't want to try and paint a rosy picture of that. Russia is grinding its way forward, particularly in the eastern Donbass. There's been some speculation about whether or not Russia is moving units from the south, from Kherson to the east, perhaps to try and reinforce that or capitalize on that. We've heard from France's President Emmanuel Macron repeating his threat that he would be prepared to send French troops into Ukraine, specifically to try and stop a Russian breakthrough. His concern appears to be that, it were Russian forces, were Russia to vanquish Ukraine, then Vladimir Putin would not stop there, and the neighbouring countries would be less. And he's painting this, as an absolute security emergency to uphold the safety and security, the order of Europe. Britain once again has officially distanced itself from that position. Lord Cameron in Kyiv suggesting that he thought that was going too far. Worth noting, though, while we're on this subject, that a former British Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey, served in the Ministry of Defence for a number of years. He's left that role, and in one of his first interviews after leaving the Ministry of Defence, he suggested he supported sending Western forces into Ukraine, British forces, most likely into Western Ukraine, perhaps to enable training, perhaps to take over roles to allow Ukrainian forces to move further east onto the front lines. Both sides are now fighting with what is called a second echelon force. After 2+ years of conflict, the professional armies that started this war are largely no longer there. Those soldiers have been killed or wounded or exhausted. And so the people fighting each other across the front lines in Ukraine are those who've been mobilized since the conflict started. And in one sense, one of the defining or at least one of the major tests for both sides will be to see which side can train these new volunteer armies to enable them to conduct complicated combined manoeuvre warfare faster than the other. Now, some statistics came out recently in the British Parliament suggesting that the UK estimates some 450,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or injured since the start of Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion. Now, that is about 100,000 more than the most recent estimate just a few months ago. These estimates are notoriously difficult to make accurately throughout conflicts. Parties in wars have exaggerated their enemies' losses and tried to play down their own. Nonetheless, the same estimate from ministers suggesting that Russia had lost about 3,000 tanks. I mean, that would be its entire stock of pre-war tanks. We know that over the course of the last 2 years, Russia has been drawing many tanks out of storage, out of long-term storage. It's been forced to rely increasingly on sort of vintage military equipment, but it is also, and it has also, ramped up its production lines in order to replace some of the equipment that it is losing. One Russian capability that we've seen perhaps growing in recent days, in weeks, has been its long-range strikes inside Ukraine. So there I'm talking about the use of either airstrikes or long-range ground-launched missiles to hit high-value targets. This week we've seen footage released by both sides showing successful strikes. From the Russian side, it appears they've been using missiles, including their Iskander missiles, including their Smerch missiles, loaded with cluster warheads or cluster bodies, cluster fuselages, if you like, to hit, we think, bases, high-value targets, but some very, very deep, up to 100 kilometers behind the front line. Similarly, very dramatic footage coming out from Ukrainian drones appearing to show a group of dozens, if not hundreds, of Russian soldiers out in the open in Luhansk district. They were hit with a volley of what is believed to be 4 American ATACMS missiles. Now, one of those ATACMS didn't explode, but the other 3 did, suggestions of very, very high Russian casualties. What this indicates on both sides is that perhaps there's been a leapfrogging of the capability of surveillance drones to resist jamming or evade detection, because both of these strikes would require real-time, fast surveillance in order to spot mobile targets or fleeting targets, targets of opportunity, targets that don't sit there forever. Both sides have to be able to spot those targets and then react quickly, bring the artillery within range or the rockets within range and fire onto target before it moves. And both sides appear to have done that. As we move forward, a couple of analysts suggesting this is also something worth keeping an eye on, because we know that America's signed off that $61 billion aid package. Large quantities of weapons and ammunition are arriving in Ukraine, have been arriving in Ukraine since our last update. The UK pledged another $500 million towards that cause as well. And so that is likely to include high-value military assets, which the Russians will be at pains to try and destroy before they can be brought to bear on the battlefield. A couple of other things worth noting since our last update. There have been really disturbing reports from the US State Department accusing Russia of using chemical weapons to clear Ukrainian positions, particularly a chemical called chloropicrin, also known as PS gas. This is primarily an agricultural product used to fumigate soil, a sort of insecticide, fungicide. It can also be used, potentially there is a legitimate use for it. It's been used in riot control in some scenarios, but used as a weapon of war, it is categorically banned. It is a chemical weapon. It is covered by the chemical weapons, the ban on chemical weapons, that convention. In the same week, I think the same day, the investigators from Human Rights Watch, a rights group, put out a report on the execution of at least 15 Ukrainian prisoners of war, soldiers who had surrendered or were in the process of trying to surrender. Now, a lot of this evidence was actually based on footage captured by Russian drones. So the Russians were filming themselves as they captured these Ukrainian positions. In one instance, it describes footage where the Ukrainians are emerging from a trench, from a bunker. They remove their body armor. One removes his helmet. They're made to lie down, and then they are all shot. One of these drones capturing what appears to be a Russian commander on the ground, capturing the audio, saying, "Take no prisoners, kill them all." I mean, and that is perhaps a salient and timely reminder of just how horrific conflict is. We can, when we see the drone footage, when we're seeing the death and devastation being enacted from a great distance, explosions in landscapes, it's easy perhaps to forget what this really means on the ground. It is men and women being maimed and killed in pretty horrific circumstances, and that is, the madness of the conflict, and that is what is driving the pressure to find a resolution to this conflict, indeed all conflicts. Curiously, while we're there, we heard from a Ukrainian general recently, deputy head of Ukraine's intelligence service, saying he did not think peace talks were even a realistic possibility until midway through next year. And that's because both sides are sort of jockeying for position on the front line, trying to get into the best position for those talks to take place, but neither side hurting enough at the moment, neither side exhausted enough at the moment to stop and feel pressured to the table. As ever, if you're watching on YouTube and you'd like to ask us a question, please do ask your questions in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer some of them next time. One of the questions this week is about F-16s. We get this regularly. Any update on the F-16s? Yes is the short answer. Suggestions in the New York Times that the first of those Fighting Falcon US-made jets could be operational in Ukraine by July. Unlikely to be all of them. There's a few dozen have been pledged across from different countries, different allies that use them. Suggestions from the New York Times, the first ones could reach there in July. Another update is that when we spoke to Britain's Defence Secretary Grant Shapps on our new World at War show, he revealed that Britain would be arming those American jets with what he called glide bombs, but I understand that is actually a reference to the Paveway 4 guided missiles. Those are both laser guided missiles and GPS guided missiles. They've really been the go-to weapon for the RAF since they were first used in Afghanistan. They've been used in Libya, most recently against Houthi rebel targets in Yemen, fired off RAF Typhoon jets, but they'll be fitted onto F-16s, we understand, when they finally make their way into Ukraine. The second question was, how many Russian oil refineries does Ukraine have to hit before it makes a difference? I think we might have already answered that a little bit earlier on. They have already made a difference. That estimate from Reuters that production went down by 14%, now back up to 90% of where it was. Production was about almost 124,000 metric tons a day. They think it's come down to about 90,500 metric tons a day. It was lower. It has recovered slightly. That has in turn led to a surge in prices at the pumps in Russia. So it is making a difference. And in one way, perhaps that is bringing the effects of the war home to people in Russia who might otherwise be shielded from it in their day-to-day lives. Of course, public opinion does matter in Russia. Vladimir Putin, there's no suggestion at all that he might be voted out of office. It remains an autocracy. The elections are pretty much just theatre. But we did see in previous conflicts, we did see in Afghanistan, when Russia was in Afghanistan for a decade, that actually it was the mothers' committees, it was the mothers of the soldiers who were coming back in coffins who ultimately managed to move the needle of public opinion across Russia. So far, that hasn't happened, and that is something that many people are looking at quite closely, not least Ukraine and of course our allies working out, is it possible to change opinion in Russia? Thank you very, very much for watching. As I say, if you do have questions, please ask them in the comments below. And if you've got a chance, do check out our new World at War show, where we sat down with Britain's Defence Secretary Grant Shapps. We discussed the war in Ukraine, Britain's support for Ukraine, and of course the conflict in Israel, and what steps he has been trying to take to revamp the United Kingdom's armed forces in the face of what he calls the shift from living in a post-war world to a pre-war world. Concerns that with events in Russia and Ukraine, the threats from China, North Korea and Iran, that state-on-state conflict has now become a much, much more real threat in the near and medium term.